Hello and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. So today's topic is training, and we're going to discuss how to make lightweight feel heavy. So with everybody having to train at home nowadays, we might have been stuck at home, or maybe our options at home aren't as heavy as we would like for the results that we would like. So I've had tons of clients over the kind of past month or so where maybe they got surprised by certain quarantines or certain issues or whatever, and they've been struggling and kind of fighting to get more at-home equipment available. So at first we kind of learned, of course, to how to just make things work as we go, and then they've been able to kind of get used equipment or order stuff here and there. But I've had clients where maybe with the first kind of couple workouts they had a pull-up bar that they could put in a doorway and a couple bands, and that was it. So when you're in various situations like that with limited equipment, or if you do have equipment that you're happy with, but you just want to kind of find more ways to make it challenging, there are tons of options. So I wanted to go through three that are helpful today, and these are three that you could start with your very next workout on how do we get kind of better results when we're limited in the degree of kind of resistance that we can create. So the first one is what I feel is kind of one of the easier ones and more commonly going to be expressed, but it's a really good one to know, is the concept of pre-exhaust. So an example of this would be if I'm doing body weight squats and I want to be more aggressive towards them or make them harder in some way. Yeah, I can just do more, but at some point doing 1,000 bodyweight squats does kind of lose its benefit in regards to what outcome you might want from it. So if I'm doing bodyweight squats to make me stronger at squatting, like I want to squat 500 pounds instead of 400 pounds, doing 1,000 of them isn't necessarily going to help develop strength. It helps develop maybe work capacity and endurance, which then can be used later on to build strength. So it isn't like it's totally useless to do 1,000 reps of squats, but it's not as a direct benefit as something that we can do using pre-exhaust. So an example of pre-exhaust in order to improve squat difficulty would be is to do a single leg glute bridge. By the way, if you don't know any of these exercise names, you can YouTube them, or you can email us at brutalirongym@gmail.com and I'll send you a link for any of these things. So you can do a single leg glute bridge, which is your upper back laying on the ground. You have kind of one foot pressed into the heel and you're pushing through that foot and squeezing your hamstring and glute to lift your hips up off the ground. So this is good for kind of core stabilization, good for unilateral balancing of strength, and it helps to isolate out the hamstring and glute. So you can do single leg glute bridges, then you go into something called a frog pump, which is really good for the glutes. Then you can stand up and do a single leg stiff legged deadlift, which again fatigues the hamstrings and glutes. And then you can do your bodyweight squats. So if you do your large movement, a bodyweight squat movement, after you do more isolative movements that target individual muscles that are involved in that big movement, it'll make that big movement feel weaker. So think of like a dumbbell chest press. If I wear out my triceps, and then I try to do a dumbbell chest press, I'm not going to be as strong in that chest press because my triceps are involved, right? Or if I did a bunch of chest flies before chest presses, that would wear out my chest before I did the chest press. So you can do more isolative movements that target individual muscles. That'll then make a larger movement feel harder. Some of the benefit of this is most people are weak, for example, in their hamstrings and glutes. So out of all of the muscles involved in a squat, most people are more quad dominant or stronger in their quads. So if I do a bunch of kind of hamstring and glute movements before I do my squat, that will make my hamstrings and glutes more challenged from the squat, and then over time they can have better development, so they won't always be the weak link. So using pre-exhaust, even when you have more or better equipment or full gym available, is still a great technique. So that's one example that we can use. Another example of how to use it for people might come across is how to make an overhead press harder. So you can do, again, different exercises before the overhead press. I can do bent over lateral raises, right into upright rows, into regular lateral raises, and then try to overhead press. So if I wear out my middle and rear kind of deltoid is a fancy word for shoulder muscles. If I wear out part of my shoulders, then when I go to do an overhead press, my overhead press is going to feel more challenging even if it hasn't gotten heavier. So again, using more isolative movements before the large movement is a great way to make that large movement feel hard. Now, we have a podcast that goes way more in depth. It has tons of great benefits to it. It's podcast 254, titled Pre-Exhaust for Big Gains Without Big Pains. So that helps you. The reason why that podcast is worded that way is not only does the benefit of pre-exhaust help make big movements feel harder, it allows you to use lighter weight at big movements. So if you have somebody who's trying to avoid joint stress, whether it's like coming back from injury, whether they are just kind of beat up and old, but anybody that wants to reduce joint stress, pre-exhaust is a great way to do that. And even if you're totally healthy and you feel strong as you ever have, it's still a good idea to do movements and techniques that reduce joint stress. So for example, if somebody benches twice a week in their training, if you go really heavy and aggressive twice a week, very quickly within that same week or within 4 to 8 weeks, you're going to accumulate some strains on the connective tissue related to that big movement. So sometimes the annoyances and challenges we put into our body when we exercise can't be fully repaired by the next time we work out. So if you do kind of aggressive models or aggressive training structures or styles, and you do that twice a week for several weeks, you can start to develop like an elbow pain, a shoulder pain. Maybe you have a tight muscle in one of the muscles related to the bench press and it's kind of annoying you, or it's starting to kind of take away from your workouts. So you'll find that maybe using techniques that are still maximal intensity, maximal effort, but they don't require maximal weight is a great way to save some wear and tear on the joints. And in the long run, that can actually make you stronger because you don't develop these small, nagging, acute little injuries or annoyances that hold back the big workouts. So even the athletes that I work with that do like powerlifting, where their main goal is strength, and I have worked with athletes who have tons of state records, national records, and stuff in bench press. So we always use some form of joint control, joint stress control in their training. So we're going to bench often, maybe 2-3 times a week so they can work on their technique, but we sure as hell don't want maximal efforts 2 or 3 times a week because they can't recover that fast. Okay, so even if you're healthy, it's a great idea to check out that podcast 254. And if you do have the interest in saving joint stress because you actually have joint problems right now, that would obviously be a great thing to check out. So if you're wanting to make lightweight feel heavier, using the idea of pre-exhaust is a great method. Okay, so everybody I just named, all those reasons, you can check out podcast 254, again titled Pre-Exhaust for Big Gains Without Big Pains. Check that out for more information. So another one you'll see that people will tout as a good idea is increasing time under tension. So for example, if I want to make, squats harder, I'll just squat for 2 minutes. Yeah, sure, that's going to make it harder, but what the hell results are you going to get for that? So again, you can increase time under tension, but you have to be mindful of whether that increase is going to get the results you actually want. So if I'm squatting as a bodybuilder, for example, I want to build or shape kind of the muscle of my legs. Squatting for 2 or 3 minutes isn't going to be a great use of my time, and it's not going to necessarily lend itself to the results that I want. Now, sometimes doing 2 minutes of bodyweight squats would actually be fantastic if you've already established muscle damage in the workout. So if I do, say, heavy leg extensions for, say, sets of 10, supersetted with a minute of squatting, hell yeah, that's going to be freaking great, and that's going to annoy the crap out of the muscles and get them to grow stronger because you already have a heavy stimulus paired with a lighter stimulus, and or you have the presence of muscle damage. So if I did a workout where I did good healthy, whatever the normal warm-up would be, I did really heavy sets of leg press, really heavy sets of half squat, and then I did 2 minutes of bodyweight squats, yes, the bodyweight squats would be useful then because the stress is already present. But if I don't have a way to do those big heavy movements beforehand, just simply doing 2 or 3 minutes of bodyweight squats is not going to necessarily lead to the results I want. So we do want to increase time under tension, but how we do that is actually what's more important. So one of the ways we can do that is by pairing together movements that are similar that use the same muscles. So an example of this would be time under tension. For if I have a light weight and I wanted to do, let's go back to that overhead press example. So if I want to build my shoulders, and I'm like, man, I don't have that heavy of weight. I guess I'll just let overhead press for 2 minutes straight. Okay, well, that's one idea, but it's not really the best idea. Whereas you can take that same weight and, like we said, do bent over lateral raises, do upright rows, do regular lateral raises, then overhead press. That might take 2 minutes altogether, just like doing overhead presses straight for 2 minutes would take. However, if you use those individual movements that are more isolative, they'll actually cause more stress and damage in the accumulation of the 2 minutes. So more time under tension is important, it is helpful, but how you apply that is very, very, very important in regards to what kind of outcome you'd want. So if you want just muscle endurance and cardiovascular endurance, then sure, squat straight for 2 minutes. If you're looking for strength development or you're looking for muscular growth or shaping, then you do have to be more careful of what you do, and actually using a circuit of similar related movements is a much better idea or much better option on how to utilize increased time under tension. So the reason why I added this one is I've seen on social media this kind of general topic of how to make your at-home workouts more effective. And I've seen people listing increased time under tension as a great way to do that. However, they're really losing the idea, losing the connection with what results the person might want from it. So an example I saw somebody say was how to increase your squat, and they suggested you hold like kind of the bottom parallel squat position for a minute straight. Okay, that's going to be challenging, but do we ever try to squat 500 pounds and pause at the bottom for 5 minutes or a minute straight? No. So it's not really an applicable way to what we would want to develop ourselves. So having circuits is a much better option. So that's the idea of how to improve upon your specific goals using the concept of time under tension. Now, if you're not sure what the amount of time under tension is correct for your goal, so if I want to get bigger muscle, well, is 60 minutes of squatting, doesn't that build bigger muscles? It actually does not, because it's not heavy enough and challenging enough to cause the muscle strain that has the response related to bigger muscles. So in podcast 214, we talk about the idea of rep ranges and what rep ranges are kind of associated with what results, and how those rep ranges are actually developed to relate to time under tension. So in podcast 214, it's titled Understanding Rep Ranges and Expected Results. And what we talk about in that podcast is they've done studies where if they put a muscle under a stress load related to a specific time under tension, what is the response that occurs to that time under tension? So if I do something very stressful on my muscles at 10 seconds or less, our body actually responds by increasing its neurological connection with the muscle, and it actually gets the muscle to fire a greater percentage of that muscle fiber available. So that's actually an increase in strength. So 10 seconds or less of an activity actually increases strength. It doesn't directly increase muscle size unless you accumulate a lot of those in the sense of increasing your volume in your workout. Whereas if you do something that's, say, 20 to 40 seconds of physical challenge, and if it's a true physical challenge where your muscles can't move anymore within that time range, that actually does relate to muscle damage that our body responds by, if you're in a caloric surplus, increasing the size of that muscle. If you're in a controlled calorie state or in a caloric deficit, it can improve kind of like the shape and the balance of that muscle. So that one's actually related not only to time under tension, but also caloric intake. And then if you do something, say 60 seconds or more, our body responds by increasing its ability to pull oxygen into the muscle cells and or utilize the oxygen that's present. And there's a bunch of science behind it, but in general, it increases muscular endurance. So if you're doing something with the intent to build muscle or to build strength, and you do it for 60 seconds or more, that isn't going to get the result that you want. So it's very important to understand the information in podcast 214 in regards to what time under tensions lead to what results, and then you'll know how to use, say, pre-exhaust, time under tension, and even the third thing we're going to talk about, how to use exercises in general to get the result you want, because you're actually in the time frame that produces the result you want. Okay, so that's helpful. The third thing we're going to look at is exercise selection and positioning. So we're going to go through a couple examples of this, and then I'll give you another podcast to check out to learn a little bit more. Okay, so an example for how do we get a better bicep exercise? Like, how do I target my biceps better? So if I'm previously doing, say, dumbbell rows, which do involve my bicep, but it also involves the muscle of the back, you can move from dumbbell rows to bicep curls. That makes sense, right? I'm going to get more bicep development, more bicep stress from a bicep curl than I will from a dumbbell row. Now, there's arguable aspects to this because you can load heavier a dumbbell row. So I might be able to dumbbell row a 150-pound dumbbell, but I can only bicep curl maybe a 50-pound dumbbell, which is better. In general, you should use both, okay? But if I'm purely only really interested in the bicep, you can make an argument that a bicep curl is better than a dumbbell row. So that's a general way to do better exercise selection. However, there's even a more specific way past that. What type of bicep curl do I do? So, for example, a dumbbell seated concentration curl is much harder to do than a regular dumbbell standing curl. So if I only have a lightweight available to me, it's better for me to pick the most isolative, not only exercise in grand scheme of like a general thing from like a row to a curl, but also in specific as to what type of curl. So a dumbbell seated concentration curl can be insanely effective with even just a 10, 15, or 20-pound dumbbell, whereas if you were trying to use a 10, 15, or 20-pound dumbbell for a standing bicep curl, it wouldn't feel anywhere near as hard. So it's helpful for us to know general changes, but also very specific changes. Another example for hamstrings is if I'm doing, say, dumbbell stiff leg deadlifts, if I go from using both my legs to just a single leg stiff leg deadlift, well then yeah, that's going to help me get more stress with whatever weight I have available. So if I only have, say, 40-pound dumbbells, I can do a better job annihilating my hamstring doing a single leg stiff leg deadlift with two dumbbells, like 40-pound dumbbells, rather than doing both legs. Now, a specific variation or change you could make is instead of doing regular single leg stiff leg deadlifts, you can do them with pauses and pulses. So for example, I can go to the full stretch position, which would be kind of like my hands and dumbbells or whatever weight I'm using being stretched more towards the floor. You go to the full stretch position and pause for maybe a count of 3. So 1, 2, 3. And then a pulse is also another name for kind of partials, is I can come up half of the range of motion and then go back into the stretch for another pause of 1, 2, 3. Then I can come all the way to the top if I want, or I could do multiple pauses or multiple partials. So I might go to the bottom and pause, come up halfway, go back down to the bottom and pause, come up halfway, go back down to the bottom and pause, and then stand all the way up. That increases the time under tension for the hamstring per repetition. So that, again, makes the exercise more challenging. So not only switching from 2 legs to 1 leg, but how do I do the 1 leg? So it's asking that next question. So another example, and I'm not trying to kind of make your brain dead, just kind of give you more ways to think, is for the chest. So if I have, just some light dumbbells and I want to do dumbbell chest press, how can I make that more challenging? Well, you can do 1 arm press rather than 2 arm presses. So simply trying to do a chest press with 1 arm at a time rather than 2 arms at a time does make it more challenging. And you can also make it another step challenging by laying sideways on the bench you have. So where your upper back is supported, but there's no support under your hips. That's going to require you to use more legs and core for stabilization, and it's actually going to cause more glute and hamstring kind of involvement. So if somebody wants to kind of pair that with, say, bodyweight squats or something, that's a great way to still aggravate your legs while you're doing an upper body movement. And that, again, increases time under tension of usage or annoyance within the workout. So there's a lot of layers you can do by not only switching kind of the general from one exercise to another, but how do I do that exercise more isolatively? So the last example I'll give, just to show some more creativity and some more thought process, is if you want to work on hip bracing and kind of impact control in regards to allowing your hips to stay strong for squats and deadlifts. So I have clients who can, like I have clients who have national records and state records and stuff in squats and deadlifts. They squat and deadlift like 3-4 times their body weight. So they're strong as hell. But if they're training from home, how do we simulate a 600, 700-pound deadlift? Well, one of the things that are important for a 600-pound, 700-pound deadlift is the ability for their hip to absorb and control very heavy weights. So there's a bunch of terminology around it, but in general, if I want to squat 600 pounds, my hips have to be able to take the impact of 600 pounds and the movement and control of 600 pounds. How in the world do I do that without heavy weight? Well, one example of how people can do it is using jumps. So we all would kind of typically think of like box jumps or vertical jumps. So that is one way that people can use kind of explosive jumping to help maintain kind of hip structural muscular structure strength. Well, that's an okay way, but there's actually better ways. So a depth jump is actually more effective than a vertical jump for people who are healthy, by the way. So, if somebody's squatting 500, 600 pounds, they're going to be relatively healthy in regards to jumping their own body weight. So if you're training at home, instead of jumping up your stairs, which simulates a box squat, you can actually jump down from your stairs. So if you go to like the second or third stair, you jump down to the floor, you have to control the impact of you landing, and then you can go right into another jump. So say a straight up vertical jump. So you can jump down 3 steps, like catch yourself into the landing, okay, absorbing the landing in your legs, and then jump right up out of that. That is a much, much, much more impactful and aggressive jump. So that'll help increase your hip, kind of, again, like we said, like the ability for the hip muscles to absorb heaviness and actually control positioning and movement while absorbing that heaviness. So a depth jump, rather than a vertical jump or a box jump, is much more useful for maintaining hip structural strength. And to get even more specific than that, you can do single leg depth jumps. So you can actually go from just 1 step or 2 steps where you jump down from a single leg, land on a single leg, and then try to jump right from there out of a single leg. That's going to have way, way more impact into the musculature of the hip. So these are creative ways or ways you can think about, how do I make light weights, or how do I make my own body weight more challenging so I can get more aggressive results. So those are a ton of examples, and if you want to learn more about exercise selection, we do have a podcast about that, number 433, titled Exercise Selection, and that's actually part 1. And if you listen to part 1, it'll tell you where part 2 is. So that's 3 things you can use, is the idea of pre-exhaust, and we have a podcast for that, number 254. The idea of understanding time under tension in circuits of exercises related to the same muscle. So that way you can maintain effectiveness of that time under tension rather than just doing the same exercise for a minute or 2 or 3. Again, that's podcast 214. And then we have the idea of exercise selection and positioning and trying to find more isolative, more specific ways to train our muscles. So whether that's changing from one exercise to another exercise or finding a harder variation of that same exercise. And that's podcast 433. So there's a ton of information in there that you can use to make light weights feel heavy. How to improve the effectiveness of at-home training when you're limited in the resistance that you think you can create. Now, we do have an offer. If you like the idea of all this, but it seems insanely overwhelming and you don't know how to do it yourself, well, that's what you have me for, okay? So in podcast number 559, we covered at-home workouts. And in that podcast, we had an offer that I would write a personalized training program with your equipment, your abilities, everything about you in mind for $50. That's insanely cheap, by the way, compared to normals and compared to anybody else you'd find online. But I will write a four-week program that you can then repeat if you want for 8 or 12 total weeks. You can then have it for the rest of your life anytime you ever want to work out when you travel or work out from home just for any other reason. So for $50, you can have a month's worth of programming and use it for more months and the rest of your life. And it's going to be personalized to the equipment you have, your abilities, and it has videos in there, like tutorial videos. Everything's personalized, everything's very explanatory. And then as you work through it the first week, I always answer questions and make sure I'm there to support you. So it's a little bit of a sales pitch, but it's because it's really freaking helpful to you. So if you can spare $50, this is an insanely effective way to spend $50, is I will write workouts for you that utilize everything that I just talked about in this podcast and about 20 years more of experience. So if you want to do it yourself, you can. Check out podcast 254, 214, and 433. Try to implement the knowledge in those podcasts to your own training, and you can do it, okay? And then podcast 559 covers an at-home workout kind of structure you can use, and it has an offer in there, like we said, for the $50 programming. So hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully it sparked some ideas, got you thinking creatively, and realizing that in no way are you limited in your results if you're limited in the weights that you have. In no way whatsoever. Okay? You can still be a total badass and achieve everything you want. Cool. So if you have any questions or if you want any assistance with services or programs or anything like that, our email is brutalironjim@gmail.com. So I appreciate you listening to the podcast very, very much. Thank you for supporting us and participating in the podcast. And I want to make sure it helps you live a healthier and happier life. So reach out to us if there's anything you need at all. Okay? Again, the email is brutalironjim@gmail.com. Cool. Okay, if you like the podcast, please share it with family and friends. The more people we help, the happier the world will be. Also, if you like this information, you can find more from us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Brutal Iron Gym. And if you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. We always do. The podcast is for you, so we want to know what you want to learn about. You can tell us at our email, brutalironjim@gmail.com. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening. And thank you for watching.